Brought to you by Penguin. Coming Up for Air by Sarah Leipciger. Read by Deborah Mcbride, Elliot Cowan and Claudia Jessie.
Prologue. L'inconnue, The Unknown Woman. Paris, France, 1899. This is how I drowned. I stood beneath the arch of the Pont Alexandre-Toi, on the left bank of the slick and meandering Seine. Moon silver, cold. I took off my coat and boots, and folded my coat neatly, and laid it over my boots, which I lined up side by side with the tips pointing down to the water. I stood quietly for a few minutes, watching the surface of the river form soft little peaks that folded into themselves again and again and again. I took a step closer to the water so I could peer down its throat. But this was the gut of the night, and even with the moonlight, the water was an opaque, bottomless thing. Not for the first time, I climbed into the underbelly of the bridge and shuffled along the arch, hugging the pillars towards the middle where the river was deeper. There was the smell of rust and cold steel, and there was the smell of the river, and there was a chance that, in this moment, things could have gone differently. A small sign from the world to tell me it would rather I stayed than left. The nasal call of some rook, a shooting star, a whistling boatman, a change in the wind. Nothing happened. So, I leaned forward, expelled my last breath, and let myself fall. The black water closed over my head like a toothless mouth. The cold was a shock, and so was the burden of my heavy clothes. I opened my eyes to oblivion. What I thought had been my last breath was not my last breath. I had been wrong about that. For a few seconds, I was as calm as music, but then my body pedaled and thrashed. It didn't want to drown. This wasn't a newfound desire, after all, to live. This was about air, oxygen, and my lack of it. My lungs, each of my muscles hung suspended, seized in pain. I kicked until my head broke the surface, and in that moment I saw the bridge passing above me. I sucked a breath of sweet air before I went under again and wheeled my arms, looking for something solid to hold as I was carried downriver. My suffocating limbs became blocks of stone. Eventually my body gave up fighting and began to sink, and beyond my control, my throat drew water. Water and river silt entered my trachea, my lungs. Something popped deep inside my ear. I vomited, and with a violent rush, more water, silt and leaves filled the evacuated space inside me. At last, a tingling started in my fingertips. It was remote, pleasant. I opened my eyes, though they may have been open all along, and there was something pale and dead floating very close to my face. My hand. And then darkness surrounded me, like steam from a hot bath clouding a mirror, and a feeling grew, too. It was as if I'd been handed the universe in a glass jar. All I had to do was open it. Just as my heart was pumping its last beats, I was hooked at the waistband by a pole and lifted onto the hard deck of a grain barge. And this is where I died. 1. L'inconnue. Before Paris. I had been living in Paris for a year and a half before my death, having gained employment as a lady's companion to an old friend of my grandmother's, a Madame Cornélie Desbons. Before receiving Madame Desbons' letter requesting I come to live with her in Paris, life for me, in my home of Clermont-Ferrand, had become empty, and I was adrift. My birth had been the death of my mother, in 1880 in Clermont-Ferrand. This was not a shock. It sometimes happened. Nonetheless, death due to childbirth was horrific. It was bloody, sweaty, and exhausting, and happened either during labour or days later from blood loss or infection. My mother's death was attended by 3 women. Her older sister, Huguette, the midwife, and my grandmother on my father.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?